Well, welcome to another episode of OneMDx, a videocast web series where we sit down and speak with individuals and leaders shaping the future of the healthcare landscape here within Australia and New Zealand. I'm really excited today as I'm joined by not one, but two guests who I'm hoping can share two very unique and great perspectives on the future of health tech and biotech innovation here, as I say, within Australia. First up, I'm joined by Jeff Reid, managing partner of an organisation called Bioshore Ventures, a healthcare-focused venture fund working with some of Australia's most exciting early stage companies. Jeff brings to the table a wealth of experience in identifying opportunities and working with founders to scale. So really interested to get Jeff's take on the future of the market here over the next few years. Alongside him, I'm joined by Will Knox, Chief Executive Officer of a company called Tetratherix, a business that many of you may not have heard of, but have recently gone public back in June. Tetratherix play in the very cutting edge and exciting space of regenerative medicine and biologics. Will's here to talk to us today about how to bring disruptive technology to market and how to scale in a really competitive climate. So gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I know it's been and continues to be a very, very busy period for you both. So thank you for carving up at a time in your, no doubt, very busy schedules.
Pleasure. No problem. Thanks for having us.
No, absolute pleasure. Look, before I sort of dive into Bioshore Ventures in a bit more detail and obviously Tetratherix, for many of us listening or those listening for the first time that haven't come across you both, can you give us a bit of a background to your own story and how you've landed kind of where you have and how you two have been working together, obviously, so closely over the last few years?
Sure. You want to see? Yeah. We finish each other's sentences.
Yeah. So it's clearly been working together for a while now.
So, look, my background originally, I did neuroscience at uni, worked in pharmaceuticals once I graduated, focusing on regenerative biologics largely. And then spent a couple of years as a rugby bum overseas, and then came back to Australia in about 2004. And just actually through some of my rugby connections, and given that I had a background in pharmaceuticals and in MedTech, landed up in Orthopaedics, which I didn't really know what the orthopaedic industry was, or any of these sort of ins and outs of that game.
Right.
And so started my career there at a company called Orthopaedics, run by Sam Scott Young, who many people from the medtech industry will know. And so myself and actually a bunch of other rugby bum mates were working there for a couple of years.
Okay.
Then we all went on our own various journeys and down different paths. For me, I ended up going to Synthes, now part of DePuy, worked as a product manager in spine there. So I really got to understand the spine industry, and that's where I was kind of focusing my efforts at Orthopaedics as well.
Okay.
And then realised there was an opportunity, going back to sort of 2010, realised there was an opportunity to bring in some pretty novel deformity gear. So the spine market can be broken into sort of degenerative pathologies or deformity. And there was a company in the US called K2M who developed this sort of game-changing means of tackling the complex spine or deformity end of the market. And so I started up a business in 2008 actually, with the view that we'd bring this gear in from the US, specifically to tackle that deformity and minimally invasive end of the market. I then sold that business to Life Healthcare in 2011, and that's where Will and I started working together. As part of my earn-out agreement, I was running the spine division there. Will was running the orthopaedic division. We started working on some Orthobiologics together,
right?
And that's where our paths first crossed.
Interesting.
Yeah, so my story started with, similar from a sort of clinical perspective, wanting to go into medicine and going into the clinical world, but then realised very quickly that wasn't for me.
Right.
And I think also just when you start to realise as a young whippersnapper that you come out of school and get into the university style, tertiary education landscape, realising just how long it takes to actually, go through the process. And if you're not really wedded to it and sort of see it as a bit of a calling, I think it can be a bit daunting as far as how long and how much work needs to go into it. So dropped out, ended up finishing a medical science degree, and then basically went straight into the industry, into Cochlear. So in fact, one of my good mates was a recruiter at the time, and found me a role in at Cochlear, which was more around sort of business analysis and marketing in the Asia Pacific region. So at that stage, it was a really exciting part of the Cochlear story as we were growing really rapidly, not only in the US, but then more through Asia Pacific as well. And so I think also being at the head office of a business like that, you get to understand, the commercial, the technical, the development, all the design parts that go into the manufacturing process, which is really interesting. So worked with them for a while, but then got the bug to go overseas. And long story short, ended up going to both New York as well as London as a healthcare equities analyst. So on the sell side, so looking at ways of basically selling medical and medical device based stocks to investors, which was actually a really awesome part of my career because I got to understand that investment and sort of more the commercial side. So coming from a sort of more production and design development landscape into more of the commercial and sort of investment part of the industry was really interesting. So I worked there for a while, and then actually came across Medtronic in one of the roles that I was doing, or one of the sort of analytical projects that I was working through, and then actually got brought back to Australia to work in Medtronic. Initially it was in the spine and biologics division, as they called it back then, and then did a bit of work with them in spine, predominantly around the launch and the management of Infuse, which is their BMP2 bone regeneration product, which is really exciting as well to be involved in such a fast-growing and innovative solution. And that kind of really sort of whet the appetite for biologics in general, and kind of formed a lot of that interest to sort of get to the point that we're at now. But then actually worked for the cardiovascular division for Medtronic as well. So kind of got cross-divisional experience within the business, which I think was a really important piece of the puzzle, because I think you can get used to a certain way, be that in the operating theatre or in the clinical development world, but then understanding the different types of physicians, the different clinical needs, the different ways to bring products to market was really interesting. So worked there for a while, but then actually left. I got the entrepreneurial bug quite early on in the sort of career journey for me, and jumped out of Medtronic and started a business called Healthgate, which was basically a patient information portal or tool that can be used for a range of different chronic disease information, so service provision and that type of thing. And so I did that for a while, actually sold that to a division of Google here in Australia that was looking at Google Health, which is now defunct and didn't sort of go anywhere, but the original sort of WebMD or Dr. Google style thing. This was back in 2008 or thereabouts. So, pretty early on in that part of the journey. So did that for a while, and then, moved more once that was sold into more of the distribution world, which is where my initial role within Life Healthcare was, looking at the orthopaedic division, the strategy around growing the business into some of the more focus areas within the industry, spine being one of them. And so, that was when we looking at acquiring the K2M distributor of spine, which was Jeff's business, and that's where we sort of started interacting, and then the rest is history.
Which is now owned by Stryker, I'm right in thinking. They made an acquisition for
actually,
K2M way back when.
Spun that out to the Scoliosi brothers. So,
that's right. I remember being in the UK actually and coming across K2M. Must have been in excess of 12 years ago now. And then obviously came to Australia and obviously knew K2M as being under the Life Healthcare umbrella, and then obviously Stryker acquiring them. So it's definitely gone through a few iterations. But that's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So that's when we started working together, and I think Jeff and I both have that entrepreneurial bent to what we want to do, and being in control of our own destiny, and so shared a common interest in particular for the biologic space. I think that's really where we saw, not only through the spine and sort of biologics and neurosurgical evolution of the industry, but just more broadly, particularly in orthopaedics as well. I think back in sort of 2010, 2011 is when we started to get a bit of a taste for what collagen-based products could do for cartilage, as an example. We were doing some work with Geishlich, which is a Swiss-based business that was doing a collagen membrane solution for arthroscopic repair of cartilage in the ankle and in the knee. And I think that's really where a lot of the understanding as to the soft tissue regeneration and how technically and clinically it can actually have a really big benefit for patients started to really come to the front. And so that's where we started thinking, well, how do we actually now, use a lot of that experience and where the industry is going? And we're a bit ahead of the curve as far as our knowledge set coming from spine, orthopedics, and those types of areas. And so that's when we jumped out of Life Healthcare and then started a business called UHealth. And that was really founded on the premise of distribution of technologies and products, but primarily focused on two different areas, not really related at all. But one is in the digital health area. And so, again, we were trying to get ahead of the curve as far as bringing products to market and trying to develop them as well, that was looking at sort of managing and controlling chronic disease outside of the traditional hospital setting. So using smartphones, digital technologies, data, that type of thing to manage chronic disease. But at the same time, UHealth also had a bent that was very much focused on cartilage repair. And so that's where we really saw from a clinical and a sort of technical perspective that we could really create some differentiation around the provision of products and finding them, bringing them into the country, but then also engaging with local physicians to sort of further develop, the regeneration of soft tissue, bone, that type of thing.
Were there many other options at that time in terms of other, types of applications or companies that were doing similar things, or was it relatively immature at that stage?
Yeah, look, it was quite immature. Cartilage regeneration it's a really tough space in the sense that you can have diffuse osteoarthritic lesions. And that's kind of the holy grail to be able to effectively treat that, because that could potentially obviate the need for hip and knee replacements. A lot of the orthopaedic people probably don't want to hear that, but
it's a big market for us, Jeff. That's so
exactly. I don't want to kill your whole business model here. But no one's come up with a solution there yet. So our focus is very much on acute focal lesions, i.e. If you have a sporting injury, you'll knock a chunk of cartilage out. And the standard of care at the moment is a procedure called a microfracture, where they go in and just put holes into the subchondral bone in order to elicit a biologic response. The challenge is that once you get that biologic response, the stem cells just float wherever. So the premise of what we were doing were based on thermogels or hydrogels, where you still do that microfracture procedure, but then you put a gel over the top to keep those stem cells where you want them, i.e. in the defect.
Localize it to that defect,
Exactly. And so there's a couple of different products that we'd worked with over the years. There's one out of Canada that we really liked, based on a material called chitosan, which is derived originally from the exoskeleton of shellfish. And we're one of the pioneering markets in Australia for that product. Because Will and I guess we're passionate about it. We saw the market opportunity. We had some key opinion leading surgeons who were really keen to get involved. I think we were the number one market in the world for that product. Also, the Australian healthcare system kind of, at that point at least, lent itself to bringing novel technologies to market. It was before MDR as MDG, so it was relatively easy for early stage companies like that to get CE mark. And then the reimbursement landscape here was really good, so you could actually justify allocating a fair bit of resource to the marketing, but then also really importantly the clinical trials around that. And so we spent a lot of time and effort working with that clinician group to build up the clinical trials, both from a registry perspective, but then also from a formal clinical trial perspective, to ensure that the products got reimbursed or maintain their reimbursement locally, but also working with the principals overseas to help them with building up their body of evidence for regulatory approvals in other markets.
Interesting. And in terms of what you're both involved with right now, obviously it's been, as I mentioned at the start, quite a busy 12 months for you both in terms of launching obviously Bioshore Ventures, obviously Tetratherix going public in June. These are pretty significant milestones that you've both been involved with. Again, for those people listening for the first time that haven't come across Bioshore or indeed Tetratherix, can you give a bit of an overview as to what those two businesses are ultimately about?
Yeah, so look, once we set up this business called UHealth that we just talked about, we actually sold that through to Device Technologies back in 2017.
Yeah.
And that was a really good partnership in that Device was looking at ways of expanding their orthopedic capabilities within the soft tissue market here in Australia and New Zealand, and then eventually up into Asia as well. So that was a really good part of the sort of the evolution of the business, and also seeing it through to being owned by a separate business and being in the hands of Device that they could use their partnership with Arthrex at the time to really expand that. But then what Jeff and I were really interested in doing is using, in fact, the proceeds or the experience that we had from selling UHealth to set up something that could be essentially focused on seed funding, if you like, the intellectual property and the transition from the IP from a university level into more of the commercial space. And so what we had really realised through many decades of being in the industry is that there's this chasm between intellectual property locally here in Australia that gets developed at the university level, and then seeing it through into more of a commercial translational environment. And so what we set Bioshore up was initially as a fund to essentially find these types of technologies and the intellectual property at the university level, and then not only use funding, which is obviously a big part of the puzzle, but also using our experience in commercialization to try and then help these founders and these academic researchers or IP developers at the university level to actually have something that's commercially viable. And so Bioshore initially was set up to start doing this with a couple of different opportunities here and there, which is actually where we found Tetratherix and set the business up with the academic founders to be what it is today, which we'll get onto. But Bioshore has evolved a bit since then, and Jeff can get into maybe a bit more of the Bioshore Ventures structure that it is now. But Bioshore was always set up to essentially find these gems in the research landscape here in Australia that we can then commercialise using not only, as I mentioned, funds, but also capability on the commercial side. Because I think it's one thing to have a good idea and a good technology, but little things like how much does it need to be made for? How much can you sell it for? How are you actually going to find it in the hands of physicians that it needs to be found in? So there's a lot of that stuff that needs to go into these technologies, and we just kept seeing all these really good examples of products that had been created at the university stage here in Australia that just get lost to either the chasm or just die on the vine because they run out of funding or they have something that doesn't have commercial viability. So, as I mentioned, Tetratherix was the first one of those portfolio companies that we found amazing researchers here. Ali Fatty, who is our sort of technical founder and CTO behind the business, had essentially come up with this completely new chemical entity that can be used for a range of different applications in regenerative medicine as well as drug delivery. But coming from the background of cartilage, when we initially came across it, we're like, it just stood out as something that was completely unique, not only in how it performs physically, but also biologically. What we'd seen for so many years is when you deliver one of these types of biomaterials into the body, you get this sort of inherent inflammatory or fibrotic response to the product, which just always has an issue with getting in the way of natural healing, which is a really big part of getting a good outcome clinically. Is you need to have the right type of tissue, not just fibrotic tissue that's in the body. And so we saw it and thought, this is actually something that we can, really get involved in and see a future. And obviously it's evolved a lot since then. But that's kind of the genesis of Bioshore and Tetratherix, which kind of came at the same time.
Yeah, interesting. So you're obviously very embedded in the Tetratherix space as CEO. So that's obviously an area that you're focused on. Jeff, obviously Bioshore has since evolved probably quite significantly from when you first looked at Tetratherix all those moons ago. What does your role look like within that business now, and what are Bioshore Ventures focused on right now?
You're right. It's evolved a lot. So it was just Will and I. It was our own little investment vehicle. Or commercialization vehicle to help bring some of these novel technologies to market. But then as Will had to focus his efforts increasingly on Tetratherix and running that business, and I still had a bunch of opportunities that I was kind of managing outside of Tetratherix, we brought some other seasoned MedTech and financial services people on board to put a more formal structure around what we were doing.
Okay.
So Bioshore Capital Partners, which was us, it morphed into Bioshore Ventures, a proper venture fund.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the cornerstone investor in Tetratherix, a group called the Ryder, RYDER Innovation Fund based here in Sydney, they provided, I wouldn't quite call it seed capital, but certainly the first sort of decent sized checks into to Tetratherix. One of the founders of that fund, Dave Bottomley, saw what we were doing with Bioshore Capital Partners and all the opportunities we had in the MedTech space and said, well, look, how about we put a venture fund together? So rather than raising money concurrently for each one of these opportunities, we can raise a pool of capital and then deploy that capital into these technologies that we've been working on for quite some time, and also bring some new promising innovative technologies into the fund. So that was about 18 months ago, or about that sort of time frame.
Okay.
And then a long-term collaborator of ours, a fellow by the name of Andrew Fox-Smith, ex-international president for Stryker, international president for Innovus, very senior medtech leader. He was kind of getting towards the end of his corporate career. And I'd sat on some boards with Andrew before. We'd co-invested in a couple of things. So we invited him in as the other general partner.
Okay.
Because he's got experience not just on growing medtech businesses, but also on the buy side.
Sure.
And brings a really interesting skill set to our group when it comes to what those exit pathways might look like, and helping structure some of our portfolio companies so they're ready for acquisition. So that was the origin of Bioshore Ventures. So now the three general partners are myself, Dave, and Andrew. Will's an advisor. We still work very closely with him on virtually all fronts, but he's got a proper day job. Whereas we're focused on running the fund.
And how does Bioshore sort of differentiate itself, comparative to a lot of other investment funds that might dabble within healthcare or the medtech space?
Well, we realise, and I guess Will and I had been living and breathing this on an almost daily basis of how many good medtech, and then look, there's different ways to define medtech, but for our intents and purposes, it really is medical devices. Okay. So there are other funds in Australia that are generalist healthcare funds, so they look after pharmaceuticals, they look after biologics, they probably dabble a little in medical devices. What we do is medical devices. That's what we know and understand. That's what we spent our careers doing. And so our focus really is wholly and solely on medical devices. So I guess that's the big differentiator, because no one else in Australia is doing that. And we're really, really good at developing these medical devices to a point at universities, as Will touched on before. We're really bad at commercialising those and providing not just the capital, but also the ecosystem and the knowledge base to help these really smart founders who are largely academics and have been based at universities, help them bring their technologies to hospitals, to the clinic. There's this big gap, and so that's specifically what Bioshore Ventures is aiming to address.
And are you typically preferring to look to invest in early stage companies or later stage businesses, in terms of their journey? What is your appetite for investment in those companies along that journey, so to speak? Yeah,
well, look, Will and I got involved in a couple of early, Tetratherix being a great example. We came in when it was really early, just kind of out of that university development stage. Another business is NanoMedics, a very similar point where our previous entity, Bioshore Capital Partners, invested in that. So with a few of these opportunities, we, I guess to an extent, have de-risked it. We came in really early and have worked with those founders to help get them to a certain point. So Bioshore Ventures tends to get involved at a later stage, around that kind of either pre-Series A or Series A investment stage through to Series C. We're not getting involved really at that university spin-out stage. A bit later, once they're 2 or 3 years post spin-out from university, that's kind of our sweet spot.
And what does the funding landscape look like within Australia typically for early stage medical device organisations historically, and perhaps what it looks like now, given the fact that you're obviously launching Bioshore, you're heavily invested, so to speak, within this market? What would you say are is the appetite for these companies right now to obviously go on the journey with you? What does that landscape look like right now?
It's really tough for medtech companies to raise capital in Australia. A perfect example is Leo Cancer Care. So this is a technology out of Sydney University based on a really simple premise. So at the moment, if you're being administered radiation therapy for cancer, the patient's supine on their back, nose to ceiling. And you've got to rotate 100 plus tons of equipment around that patient in order to administer the radiation beam.
Okay.
So you need to build these huge facilities with 5 metre thick walls, 3 stories high, in order to just get the machinery in there. The machinery itself is very expensive and then very expensive to operate, because you can imagine rotating 100 tons of machinery around a stationary patient is really costly. So these researchers come up with a really simple concept. Rather than rotating the machine around the patient, how about we sit the patient upright and rotate the patient within the machine?
Okay.
Right, so you can then scale the machine right down, brings both the required facility size right down, but then also the cost right down. There's actually clinical benefits as well that's emerged to treating a patient in an upright position versus a supine position. They couldn't raise money in Australia, so they got some government grants. They built the business to a point where there was enormous promise there, but there was this funding and knowledge gap in Australia when it came to taking the business to the next level. So they had to re-domicile to the UK to raise capital.
Okay.
And so in 2020, they relocated the whole business, all the IP, everything else went to the UK. And they raised the money there. They have subsequently got FDA approval, CE mark. They've launched this technology all around the world.
Okay.
And now they've got 70 outstanding purchase orders. And so we as a fund have come in actually at their Series C, so their scale-up capital round, just to help them meet market demand. So if Bioshore Ventures was around 5 years ago, that's a perfect example of a company that we would like to think we're smart enough to invest in. Could have got in a much lower valuation, and help with our contacts around the world and locally could have helped them really scale that locally. We've come in much later than we would have liked there, but we still thought it was a compelling investment proposition just because they've got a clear liquidity pathway with a NASDAQ IPO next year. But unfortunately, a lot of these really promising technologies are forced to go offshore, or as Will said, they sometimes just die in the vine because we don't have that pool of capital or that knowledge base to help them bring those technologies to market.
Yeah, interesting. Which is a shame, given the infrastructure of the healthcare system over here is such a positive one compared to other countries. As I say, there seems to be a relatively healthy funding model here as well. So it's a real shame that these companies are perhaps having to go overseas. So hopefully Bioshore can sort of bridge that gap.
Well, particularly with the superannuation system that's here in Australia as well. And the public markets having just gone through the process, to try and access a lot of that superannuation money in the public markets, of which there's about over $4 trillion for us to access. It's one of those things that there's not enough early sort of patient capital or patience around investing into this space, particularly with the super funds, because it's just too small or it can take too long. And so, it's a bit of a shame that there is so much great work that's getting done, particularly at the universities and the research level here in Australia. But as we've mentioned, it just doesn't necessarily get the attention from the pools of capital that exist. And so to try and then get access to it, and luckily the ASX is an exchange here in Australia that's very supportive of pre-revenue, pre-approval products in our sector. And so, but having said that, trying to go through that listing process and to be a listed business is not an easy one. And you got to have a lot of things that need to go right, and it's a lot of hard work, and you still need to get that funding to get to that stage. So it's definitely in a state of flux, the sort of early stage medtech environment here in Australia. And luckily, I think we've seen that there are opportunities that we can try and use, even with Tetratherix as an example, to try and use as a bit of an example of what can happen and what can actually be performed or delivered to the market with the right group, the right funding, and the right patients.
So obviously, major milestone moment, like you say, to get a business to the point where you are going to go public, and like you touched on, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, no doubt, goes into that process. What was the tipping point for the business at that point to say, yes, this is the right pathway for us, and now's the right time?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it is somewhat related to that funding landscape that we have here in Australia. And I think for us, particularly with Tetratherix and the platform opportunity that had been created technically, the business moves and has always moved at a particular cadence that was really quite quick. And so when you go through these private sort of venture rounds and trying to get private venture funding, particularly here in Australia in this sector, it can just take too long.
Right.
Like, it just really slows you up. And so one of the things that we need to do across the platform is think about the supply and demand on the manufacturing side in the future. And so we're only a couple of years away from really needing to have a drastic increase in the ability to supply product for the demand that's coming from compounding opportunities on the platform.
Right.
And so that meant we had to create a new manufacturing facility, a new HQ. And so to fund that, obviously it's not a cheap exercise, but then to try and go through the private funding here in Australia or even offshore would just take too long. And so the benefit of having access to faster capital on the public markets helps in that regard. And so we were thinking, now's the time where we need to raise to really build that infrastructure and the facility that we need to meet the demand. And so maybe now's the time.
Sure.
So we did a pre-IPO round sort of latter part of last year in November, December, really just to sort of test the waters as to, is this a story that the market's going to be receptive to? Yeah. It is a big different pool of investors and type of investment sort of landscape that you deal with in private versus public. In the fund management world, in the public markets, things are very different. And it's a completely different pool, right? So we just thought, let's just see what it's like and whether the fund management sort of landscape is receptive to it. Thankfully, oversubscribed, great pre-IPO, really good feedback from the market. So we thought now might be the right time to pull the trigger and we often joke that, you've got to wait for the IPO window to be ajar. And so for us, it wasn't necessarily ajar. We just jumped straight through it. And so it was kind of, really just going hard on the opportunity. And I think in hindsight, it was the right decision. I think for us, and as we've talked about today, there is a really sort of interesting differentiation in the story that we're telling, which is a new way of bringing products to market. It's a completely new platform of product and material that can have a whole range of different clinical applications. And so it just goes to show, I think, what we were talking about before about the local market wanting to invest in this space and wanting to be involved, but not having the right amount of access or understanding for a new story that comes to market.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obvious that you've both had, a bit of a heritage when it comes to biologics and regenerative medicine, obviously from your orthopaedics and spine days many, many years ago. If you look at the healthcare landscape as it stands right now and even into the future, what are the areas that you guys are most excited about and what do you see, perhaps the greatest potential in as you look forward?
Could be really boring and say AI, like every other bugger out there. But that doesn't necessarily hold true. And in some instances, absolutely it does. Because increasingly you'll see medical device hardware paired with software and building big data sets to more effectively then utilize the hardware. So that plays a part. But there is still a place for just better widgets out there. And so it's really hard to give a blanket answer to that because it depends very much on the disease state, the technology, everything else. Look, everyone knows that software, data analytics, AI is going to play a massive societal role. And so that definitely holds true for MedTech and more specifically medical devices. Almost all emerging medical technologies will have some sort of data capture component, maybe apart from biological or regenerative therapies, but a lot of the physical devices, the actual hardware, will have some sort of data capture associated with it. But it's, we're dealing with everything from enormous linear accelerators for treating cancer right down to tiny little brain chips for managing a condition called hydrocephalus. And all of those involve some degree of data capture, data analysis, that type of thing. But I think it'd be lazy just to say AI is going to solve all the world's problems, and every technology should only be valued on its AI or large data set potential. It's a lot more nuanced than that.
I think for me, there's a real shift in just the global healthcare delivery landscape that's going more towards, like, say, for example, in the US with ambulatory surgery centers, ASCs. and patients demanding to be treated in minimally invasive manners with a lot better recovery cycles, and also just things like drug delivery and ablation and all of these types of treatments and modalities that can be delivered and performed through minimally invasive style access. So rather than the traditional patient coming into the operating theatre and being opened up and, you've got blood everywhere and you've got incisions that you need to deal with, I think the idea of treating patients outside of that traditional operating theatre setting with minimally invasive techniques that can be delivered through catheter systems, I think the technologies behind catheter, whether it's ablation, drug delivery, any of these applications that can be done so simply and effectively. Think about, radioisotopic delivery for glioblastoma as an example, or, oncology applications that can be treated through ablation or through delivery mechanisms through catheter ablation or catheter delivery more broadly for a patient that can come in and out within an hour, day procedure, or just the delivery of materials or devices that are now miniaturized.
Yes.
I think that's really where a lot of the patient movement or the patient cycle is getting to. And obviously the healthcare system and the economics that come with that is going to be something that's appealing not only for the patient, but the physician as well as the healthcare system.
Yeah.
So I think there's a big movement that we're seeing around just that sort of general catheter-based, minimally invasive applications that can be across a range of different applications. Now, things like, hip and knee replacement, as we talked about before in orthopaedics, there will always be a place for metal products that can be implanted and sort of, have that type of application. But increasingly what I think we're going to find is more and more applications within that sort of traditional treatment setting are going to be done differently through minimally invasive or preventative measures early on, be that through, regenerative capabilities, biomaterial capabilities. Again, I'm a bit biased coming from the world, but that's where I think a lot of the landscape's moving, and it's pretty exciting.
I think robotics will underpin a lot of that as well, because robotics traditionally was just seen as the big Da Vinci robot.
That's right, in general surgery.
Largely for taking people's prostates out.
Yeah.
It's really shifted over the last couple of years. It's shifted significantly to having this clinical utility across virtually every surgical indication. Everything from needle biopsies through to increasingly just general surgery, brain surgery. The robots and the navigation systems are being miniaturized to a really significant extent.
Yeah.
So I think to Will's point, when you look at an ASC, an ambulatory surgery center in the US, they're not going to have a big Da Vinci robot in there, but they will have some really small, very specific robots to treat specific indications. And so robotic surgery, I don't think it's ever going to, certainly not in the next few years. It won't replace the need for surgeons, but it will make those surgeries more streamlined, will make them more accurate, and will allow them to be performed in that outpatient setting rather than a traditional operating room under general anaesthetic.
No, it's interesting. And if I, reflect on the businesses that we've recruited for over the last year to 2 years, a big focus is around enabling technologies and the emergence of robotics in things like the neurovascular space. Spine seems to be just starting now to sort of pick up the pace when it comes to robotics. Orthopaedics has gone through that evolution. And now if you don't have a robot, it's almost difficult to compete to a degree in certain areas. But these other subspecialties now alongside ortho and implants. And if you look at the general surgical space as well, whereas Da Vinci owned that space for so many years, you have 4 or 5 different platforms now that are coming into that market.
I think there's also this kind of new segment within the market that's almost like the marriage of devices with drugs and biologics and kind of merging into this almost like a precision therapeutic style, robotic or precision guided therapeutics with imaging that overlays with delivery with drugs. And so I think the traditional setting in the industry, which has been pharma, device and, hardware, I think a lot of it is now starting to merge and you're getting a lot of these new modalities that I think we call precision therapeutics, which is, as I mentioned, that sort of overlay of the delivery capabilities with imaging as well as drugs and preventative measures, minimally invasive access. And it's really exciting sort of time in the industry, an inflection point for that type of thing. But what it's going to present is really interesting dynamic on the corporate level, because not only are you going to have these new sectors within the industry that are popping up, but it's going to make a device company who's traditionally dealt with hardware or implants all of a sudden need to be playing in pharma and precision guided therapeutics and vice versa. So it's it's going to be interesting to see how those big corporate players perform and act within the M&A space, but then also just how they start to divest different units within the businesses that we're seeing a lot more of now as well.
So and it changes the business model significantly, because rather than just selling lumps of plastic or metal, all of a sudden you've got to build these adjunctive technologies into your overarching business model. And there's big bits of capital equipment often. And so you're giving those away for free in order to you actually sell the hardware. But that I think will flip on its head in time as the driver of purchasing decisions within hospitals are going to be the big bits of capital equipment. Some of these therapeutics won't play as important a role. So I think we're going to see a big shift over the next few years from being still, from a revenue perspective, the industry focusing on selling bits of metal and plastic to increasingly, how do we monetize these enabling technologies? And the therapeutics actually are almost a byproduct of the enabling tech.
Yeah, watch this space. And just coming on to, I guess, some of the founders that you've worked with, Jeff, or at least those, that you're perhaps looking to work with, and same with yourself, Will. Do you tend to identify common traits across that founder community that you look for? Yes, obviously you need to have the product, right? You need to have a viable product that you believe in, that can, that you feel you can scale. But as far as the founders that you're working with, are there certain traits that you tend to look for there?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you've got to have the horse and the jockey,
right? Yeah, sure.
And I think the first thing that will often get us interested is the technology itself. Let's call it the horse. But if you don't have the right people or the right person at the helm and a good team around them to help deliver, then we, as a venture fund, just wouldn't invest in the technology. I'd almost say that the leadership and the team around the technology is more important than the technology itself.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, we've had examples where the technology that we've come across has been amazing in the right market with the right term at the right time, and the management just hasn't been either passionate enough, open to suggestions, or driven enough, and we've said no. And so there are quite a few of those examples. So to answer your question, I think passion's a really big one. But I think also the idea that the one founder, be that academic, research, or otherwise, is going to know everything is just not realistic. So having a founder who is open to, or having the humility to then be open to suggestions on how things should be done, and maybe taking some advice, but at the same time being so wildly passionate about what the product is that they're bringing to market, is a really unique and very hard to find combination. I mean, we're lucky with Tetratherix that Ali and Tez, who founded the business, had all of that in spades, which was, I think a very unique part of the proposition. And I think, to be honest, is probably why it's been such a success, because we've been able to come in and provide the commercial and the sort of corporate and investment side of things that they're open to bringing on and to work into the model. But we're not trying to change anything from a technical or, an academic or research perspective. And so it is a bit of a fine balance between all of those different parts of the story. But there's one thing to have a good academic or a technical style sort of approach to things, which can also, if it's too technical, can get in the way of being open to commercial realities.
Sure, yeah.
And so even to the point where there's some technologies that, as we mentioned before, might be fantastic science experiments in a lab or might have really good technical capability or viability, but it's too expensive. You haven't got a quality system and there's no market for it. The physicians aren't going to use it. In the example of orthopaedics that we've seen before, you can't deliver it arthroscopically.
Sure.
And so they're the things that we need to come in and be able to say, you need to think of all these things from the outset, because if you can't answer these questions, then it's not going to go very far.
Yeah. I think also being a really effective academic is a very different skill set to being a really effective CEO. They're actually wildly different because the focus for most academics is the research and publishing that research. It's publish or perish, right?
Yep.
Whereas the focus for a CEO is, how do I get this thing to market? How do I commercialize and monetize this?
Yes.
And they come from very different worlds, and very rarely will you see an academic who innately has that. In fact, most academics, because they've been very focused on their research project, they just don't have that skill set. So that's why I think humility plays an enormous role. And I know that they talk about humility a lot at Tetratherix, because you've got to be humble enough to realize that no person can do it all. You've got to have a really good team around you. And without that team, you're never going to be able to capitalize on what might be world-leading research. So we've seen a lot of really smart academics or really smart clinicians who develop a product, but they don't have that broader commercial lens, or they don't even have the ability to understand that they need to have that broader commercial lens or skill set around them, and will pass on those opportunities if they're not willing to acknowledge they can't do it all themselves.
Some good lessons there. And if you look to the next 12 months for Tetratherix in particular, Will, what does that look like? I know there's a lot going on with obviously the new manufacturing facility that you're moving into, but what are the key things that you're going to be focusing on over the next 12 months?
So we have 5 particular products that are on the platform that we talk about in the prospectus as our sort of near-term commercialization opportunities. They're in 3 different buckets or franchises. One is in bone regeneration, where we're using the material to more effectively regenerate bone within oral and maxillofacial applications, as well as in orthopaedics. So they're 2 different products. I mean, it's the same underlying product itself, but 2 different 510K pathways for different indications and different partnerships. And so that's in bone. And so those 2 products will be FDA approved in the first half of 2026 calendar year. So that's a really big inflection point for the business, as you can imagine, first approvals, first commercialization. We've also got 2 products within our spacing franchise, which is where we're using, again, that same underlying polymer material, but to create space in the body to optimize a range of different clinical indications. One is for prostate radiation therapy, so where we're using the material injected around a prostate to create space around the surrounding anatomy to be a bit safer and more efficient and more optimized in the radiation that's being delivered. But then also in ophthalmics, which is a really interesting opportunity where we're using, again, that same material, but to create and maintain space in the eye for cataract surgery, so intraocular lens replacement. So they're both under joint ventures. And so in the next 12 months, they'll both of those JVs themselves will go through a funding process, because it's a separate sort of cap table and balance sheet that we're running. So that's also really interesting. But then also for Tetratherix, which is our prostate spacer opportunity, we've got our first in human clinical study, which is really exciting. So we'll have some news coming out on that in the next sort of month or 2 after filming this today. But then the last part of that puzzle and the 5 products is for Tetraderm, which is our tissue healing solution. And that's where we're using that same polymer material delivered into surgical incisions prior to final sort of suturing and closing up. Not to be confused with more of a wound style, application. This is actually preventing scars forming in the first place. So this is to minimize dead space and down-regulate myofibroblast activity, which essentially prevents scars forming for a range of applications like cesarean sections, hip and knee arthroplasty, talking about orthopaedics, as well as a range of different other sort of plastic and recon businesses. So look, that's the 5 products. Over the next 12 months, we'll have multiple FDA approvals, we'll have revenue generation, first in human trial results, and then importantly, as we mentioned before, a new facility that we'll be moving into sort of the next quarter or 2 that will be a really exciting inflection point for the business. So lots going on. And again, coming back to timing as far as the listing goes, the deliberate decision to list when we did was down to making sure that you've got a good news flow that the market is receptive to. And so too often we see businesses that are listed and then they come out with a great story and a great technology, but the public market is very fast moving and very fickle, and they need stories all the time. And so hearing good news and projection of deliverables is a really important part. So that's part of, again, why we chose to list when we did, because we've got all of this stuff that's coming out. Obviously pipeline products coming behind it as well, but that'll be busy 12 months
busy
ahead.
12 months, and some fantastic milestones there to look forward to. And what about yourself, Jeff, with Bioshore? What are you sort of be working on over the next 12 months?
So the initial objective is just to get the fund fully capitalised. Is fund 1. And So we're working hard to get it to a point where we can write the checks we want to write.
Yeah.
We've committed to 2 companies already.
Okay.
So Leo Cancer Care, which I mentioned before, another one out in New Zealand actually called Katea Health, which is a little intracranial pressure monitor for a condition called hydrocephalus to ensure that kids in the majority of instances, it's generally kids who are affected by this disease, can be more effectively managed and can prevent a lot of hospitalisations and frankly a lot of deaths. It's a really innovative technology, so we're working very closely with the founders there to help commercialise that. We've got another 3 or 4 technologies that we're in very late stage due diligence with.
Okay.
So we want to round out the portfolio, which will probably end up being about 7 to 8 companies in total once we're fully capitalised.
Okay.
And then working with the founders, with the teams to help them bring those technologies to market.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a really good place to finish, guys. It's been a real honour to have you both join us today. Just to understand a bit more about, one, I suppose, the funding landscape for early stage medtech companies, and obviously to hear a success story in Tetratherix and the journey that you continue to be on. I think many of those tuning in probably don't know too much or won't know too much about the early stage medtech space here within Australia as it continues to grow and hopefully bludgeon over the next few years. So thanks ever so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join me today. It's been fantastic sitting down and speaking with you both.
No worries. Thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks, Kim.